Alright, so this is going to be a tutorial on how to actually make maps in the map maker. Um, if you haven't already installed the project, you're going to want to go see the other previous tutorial 0 and 0.1 on how you actually install stuff. But if you've already done that, we can just go ahead and hop into the Bean Battles Map Maker Unity project here. So very briefly, I'm going to go over something you see in this top toolbar called the Map Maker tab. So in here we've got a few options: new map, create prefabs, record data, build all bundles, build asset bundle, and remove all bundles. So the only one that's important for this video is new map. The other ones I'll go over in the next tutorial, but here you're just going to want to go to map maker and then click new map. A little GUI will pop up and you'll get a few options. You'll see map name. So for this tutorial, I'm just going to call it example map. And then you'll see map style, Beantown, shipment, campout, or custom. So these are just kind of preset sizings that you can use. If you want to make your map the size of Beantown, shipment, or campout and whiteout, you can do any of these three. And then if you want to do your own custom size, you can click custom and select a grid size, a terrain width, and a terrain length. So for example, Bean Battle's grid size is about 200, shipment is 300, and campout is 700. And then the terrain size for like campout, for example, is 1000. So you can kind of base your sizings off of that. I'll do custom and I'll do like a 400 grid size with a 500 terrain size. Then you'll see another option at the bottom that says include terrain. So if you want to actually have terrain, you don't have to. You can just have it kind of be an empty map with only objects in it. But traditional Bean Battles maps do have terrain, so I recommend using this, especially for this first example map. I'm going to use it. So just include terrain, make sure you name it, choose your size, and then create a map. And you will see this kind of blank default map here. You can use right click to pan your camera around. You can use left click to interact with objects here. You can use scroll in and out to kind of move your camera around. And then if you do that while holding right click, you can kind of aim it a little better. You can also use WASD combined with scroll wheel to move around. And then there's a few buttons as well if you want to interact with game objects. You can click on that and you can click W to bring up these three kind of colored axes where you can move the object along. You can click E to bring up these axes where you can rotate the object, and then R if you want to change the scale of the object. So that's pretty simple there. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about here are these three little boxes, just very briefly. So these three boxes are, as you probably already noticed, they're called player spawn, weapon spawn, and vehicle spawn. So these are three little prefabs you can have in this prefabs folder down at the bottom left that just indicate to the tool where you want to have specific spawns at. So you can go into this prefabs and drag them in however you want, and at these coordinates here, so 13, 2, and 0.5, it'll place a player spawn, and then over here I can do a weapon spawn, or a vehicle spawn, sorry, and then a weapon spawn. So that's just very basic. Like right now I could put this into Bean Battles and we would have a flat white grid with these three spawns. Wouldn't be very interesting, but you could. And for now I'm just going to delete these. You don't need them just yet. So after that, you can see this little terrain object here. If you click on the white thing or in the terrain in this hierarchy, it'll bring up this little menu. You've got a bunch of buttons. The main ones we're going to focus on are these first four: raise lower terrain, paint height, smooth height, and paint texture. So first, I'll just start blocking out a nice little terrain that I want. You can change the opacity of your brush to see how harsh the scaling is. So if I do that, it's a lot lighter. You can just change the brush size to see what area you want to affect. But I'm just going to make a very simple little mountain kind of thing right here. I'm not trying to make it look pretty. Maybe I'll go ahead and add some ridges or something, some hills throughout the map. This is just an example. We don't have to go all wild making everything perfect. You'll notice that everything is very bumpy. So what I can do is I can go in this and smooth the height out. If I change the opacity, it'll make it a little harsher, or it'll make it more smooth. It'll make the smoothing harsher. And it'll kind of just, you see it's removing those little inconsistencies that it has and making everything a lot nicer. I recommend smoothing out your terrain generally. If you want to make this something more, something a little easier to walk on, like for example the camp out map, you can go to this paint height option where you can just kind of directly select a height you want to and then just paint it right to that height. So here I've set it to 100. Maybe I'll set it to like 70. Yeah, I'll set it to like 50. And you can see it just immediately either raises or lowers the terrain to that height. So it's kind of more akin to the camp out mountain where it's nice and flat. And I'll just make a flat mountain, and then I'll make some little, make some kind of ridges going up around it. Maybe have something leading up to it, you know, however you want to do it. And then I can go and smooth it out, make things a little nicer, and boom, we've got our terrain. Another thing you'll notice is that it's completely white, very boring, very bland. So we can go to this paint texture tab, and then click edit textures, add texture, and then in here we'll just click select. And there's a bunch of textures by default that I've taken from Bean Battles. Here I'm going to just use this grass rock albedo. I'm going to use, let's see, I'll use the sand albedo, and then maybe I'll use dusty road, sure. And right now it looks kind of ugly. You can see there's a repeating rectangular pattern going throughout this that just does not look good. So what you can do is you can click on one of your textures. Here we'll go to edit texture, and then you can change the size of the tiling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it to something very large, like 100, and you can see how it's gotten rid of that rectangular pattern. This is a little too large though, so maybe I'll do something like 50. And the repeating pattern is still there, but it's a lot less noticeable. So you can sort of choose that however you want. Maybe I'll do like 25, and you'll see kind of, it just looks a lot nicer than the smaller ones. We can hit apply, and I will probably do that for this one as well. Maybe I'll make it a little larger. I'll do like 30. And then you can click on your texture in the paint texture tab, and then you can paint your texture. So maybe I'll make this mountain more sandy. I'll make it a sandy mountain. Move our camera to a nicer spot. Make this brush a little bigger. And we can just paint sand all over our map. And you can do this with whatever textures you want. If you have your own PNGs that you want to use for a map, you can go and just go to this texture 2D tab, go to your files, and then you can just click and drag them into here, and it'll automatically import them, and you can use them as textures for this. Now I'll go back to here, and I'll just continue drawing. Maybe I'll add a road going through somewhere. I'll make a kind of weird road. It doesn't have to be fancy. This is just a very basic tutorial. You know, I'll add some solid grass as well. just kind of you can layer textures based on their opacity and their target strength to kind of change colors or change whatever. So maybe I want to make something a little greener. I can add this green texture. And you know, this could be just like grass or something. I can change the target strength and the opacity, and kind of, you can see how that one's a little more see-through, a little lighter than this one. That's really all there is to texture painting. You can get a lot more in-depth and nicer if you want to, and you definitely should, but this is just an example, so I'm not going to do that. Another thing here, like we've already gone over these prefabs, you can just kind of click and drag them in. If you don't have an option to move them, just press W, remember, and it'll bring up these moving axes. We can sort of just put them around however we want. You're going to want to have enough so that there will always be equal to or more than how many players you have. So you'll probably want at least 16 spawns if you're going to do a 16-player lobby. Because if you have more players than you have spawns, the game is not going to like it, and it's just going to break because there's going to be one player that can't spawn in, and that does not work. So, you know, maybe I'll just scatter these around on top of my mountain here. So we've got some weapons. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. Nice and simple, just like that. Now this map is very empty. There's not a lot of stuff going on here. It's pretty bland. There's no objects. There's no houses. There's no rocks. There's no trees. And I don't like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Google or Firefox, whatever you use, and I want to find an asset. So I've already found this low poly tree on itch.io, which is a great resource for finding free game assets. So you can go to like itch.io and then 3D. Bean Battles uses like a low poly style, so if you want it to be more Bean Battles themed, you can find low poly assets. There's a lot of free assets, there's a lot of paid assets. It really just depends on what you're looking for. You can also go to the Unity asset store here. I believe you have to log in to use these assets, and it'll just directly put them into your Unity hub. But there's a lot of great assets on Unity asset store. You can go to like Turbo Squid. You can find lots of free 3D models here as well. But I'm just going to use the one I've already found on itch.io. So I'll just download now. It's called Joseph Reich's Low Poly Tree. Thank you, Joseph. Really appreciate it. I'm going to download the zip. You can download the Unity package and just it's sort of more useful for larger assets. So if there's like a Unity asset that already has a bunch of prefabs in it, you can do that, but this is only one, so it doesn't really matter. I'll just extract that, and I'll get these two things here. I can open up Unity, and I'll go to prefabs, or you can maybe make if you want, you can create a new folder for like imported assets. You just right click assets and click create folder. And I'll go there, I guess, and I'll just click and drag both of these into my project. So immediately you're going to notice this tree is tiny and it's gray. So I don't like that. I don't want a tiny little gray tree. So what I can do is I can go in here and I can scale it up. So I can maybe make it like 30 by 30 by 30 scale rather than 1 by 1 by 1, and you can see it's a lot larger. And for reference on how large things are, you can go into this hierarchy here and right click 3D object capsule, and oh, it's kind of far away. This capsule is pretty much the size of a Bean Battles player. I scale, make sure it's 1, 1, 1 on scale, and that's about how large a Bean Battles character is. So you can see this is a pretty big tree relative to the player. Maybe I'll lower the size a little to like 20 by 20 by 20. So we've got a nice big tree here, but it is still gray, and that is an issue. So what I can do is I'll want to go to my little tree asset here, right click in this imported assets folder, go to create, and then go to material. Now I'll create a new material. I'll just call it tree material. The first thing I'm going to want to do is I want to change the shader to legacy shaders diffuse. Diffuse is generally the shader you'll want to go. If you're more knowledgeable about the game or about Unity, you can try other shaders, but generally a good rule of thumb is legacy shaders diffuse. Now diffuse shaders use a texture for what their color is, or well, you can use a texture or you can use a color. So here we've gotten this texture from the file that we've imported, so I can go here and use this tree diffuse texture as the material, and I can just pop it onto the tree, and you'll see that it has taken the colors and it's pretty nice. This tree actually has a few child game objects. So I've applied the texture to the tree part of it, but I haven't applied it to the stump. So I can do that here as well by just dragging the material onto the object. And you'll see it's all textured, it's all colored. Now with this imported asset, we've gotten this animator. I don't need that. So if your object that you import has any things that you don't want on it, you can right click this component, the gear, and click remove component. It'll just get rid of that. We've also got this colliders game object that has nothing in it, so I can delete that as well. I don't need it. So we've got our colored asset here, but there's still an issue with it. If we put this in the game right now, it won't have any collision. So what I can do is I can go to something with a mesh filter. It needs to have a mesh filter. Well, sort of. Okay, if you're going to use a mesh collider, this is a collider that takes the exact shape of the mesh. So here I'll do it on the tree part. I'll add a mesh collider, and it adds a collider to the mesh. It perfectly conforms to the mesh's dimensions. There are a number of other colliders which I'll go over in a second, but if you've got a mesh filter, you can use a mesh collider. The issue with these is that they're not very performant. So this has a lot of vertices, which pretty much means that the game has to check a lot more spots for collision, and it can be laggy if you're using a ton of mesh colliders. It won't be noticeable with a few. It probably won't even be noticeable with like 100, but the more you use, the worse the performance is going to get. You'll see in this mesh collider component that there's an option called convex. So if you click on that, you'll see that it gives you this green outline of a different collision box. Now you'll notice that it is not very accurate. If I turn this off, you can see it's perfectly accurate. It conforms directly to dimensions. But if I make it convex, it doesn't. It has a convex mesh colliders have a more limited array of vertices that it can use. So it performs a lot better, and it performs a lot better, but it has less space that it can go into. So if you have anything with kind of empty spaces or things that jut out, you're not going to want to use that. But if you've got like a ramp, maybe, you could definitely use a convex mesh collider. There's another issue with concave mesh colliders as well, though. So if you don't have convex selected, it'll be concave. It'll perfectly conform. And the issue there is that clipping in bean battles is a much bigger issue with concave mesh colliders. So players will kind of be able to run through objects a lot easier. There's not much of a fix to that. You could try adding a rigid body to your component, making sure you turn off use gravity and turn on is kinematic, and this will make it a little bit it'll give it a little more accurate collisions. It'll make it so it's harder to clip through. You can kind of mess with these settings and see how it affects it, but it still won't be perfect. So for something that you don't want players to be able to clip through at all, you want it to be a lot more, just a lot better in general. You could use something like a box collider. You could use a capsule collider. You could use a sphere collider. Those are pretty much the main ones that you're going to want to use. So, and if you're doing something more complex, you can maybe look up tutorials on Unity colliders and see what different objects there are, or different types there are, but these are the primitive colliders. So this shape is kind of boxy, so I'll just use a box collider here. I can click Edit Collider, and then I can sort of conform it to the shape of this tree. Now, generally, you're going to want your collider to be not like jutting out in spaces, so it's a lot nicer to have a smaller collider than it is to have a bigger collider, because then players won't be colliding with invisible things that they can't even see, because that's no fun. So this is a little smaller than the actual tree, so maybe I don't want it to have these kind of pokey edges. So instead I could go and remove component and add a capsule collider. You can see here that well, it's a capsule, so it's not a square. It's more like spherical, more kind of like bean shaped, I guess. And this should work pretty well for what we have. It just gives you a nice bounding box for what the collision is going to be, and I'll use that for this stump here. And then I'll use this rigid body concave mesh for the tree, just as an example of what colliders you can use. One more thing for putting assets in the game, you can use some shapes called primitives, which are like default meshes. So if you go into this hierarchy at the left, right click in an empty spot, and then go to 3D object, you'll see a number of different things. The main ones you're going to want to focus on are cube, sphere, capsule, cylinder. You can kind of fiddle with quads or planes, I guess, but these four are generally what you want to go for. So here I could go and add a sphere. And I'll bring that over to us real quick. So you can see I've got a nice sphere here. I mean, it's literally just a sphere. By default, these will have colliders. So this has a sphere collider that perfectly fits it already. And maybe I can make that a little bigger just to show you. We've got our sphere, and I can click Control D on it and add another sphere. Now we got two spheres. There is a bit of an issue with this though, because by default it uses a default material with the standard shader, and Bean Battles, for whatever reason, doesn't like that. These objects will be partially invisible, so what you're going to want to do is add what we did earlier. You're going to add a legacy diffuse shader. So you can go into this mesh renderer thing and click materials, go to element 0 and click this circle here, and you can use a default diffuse material, or you can go and create material and then make your own legacy shaders diffuse material and add your own color to it, whatever you want. And I can drag that on. Now I've got a red sphere over here. So yeah, you'll want to use diffuse shaders, because if I don't do that and I make another sphere right here and I use a standard shader, oops, if I use a standard shader, I can kind of show you what happens in the game. So yeah, those are primitives. Nice and simple, nice and primitive. That is the main core of assets. One more thing though, I guess, is you can turn these objects into prefabs, which essentially means that you can just turn this whole big thing into one simple thing that you can use anytime you want. So if I go to low poly tree and I click this root object, low poly tree, and I just drag it into a folder. Right now I'll drag it into my prefabs folder because I want to make it into a prefab. you'll see it has all the components of the tree right here, and I can just go and drag them in, and it'll just make me another tree with all the collision, all the stuff that I put on it before, which is very nice. I can, just go ahead and do all this, anything that I want, and I can also click Control D on the keyboard to duplicate. I can just pop a bunch of trees around on my sandy cliff here. Now we've got a little forest, which is nice. So yeah, that's how you make prefabs. Very useful. I could even select all of these, and like, oh, whoops. I could select all of them and put them as a child of an empty object. So like if I click these and drag them all onto this game object, I can turn this game object into a prefab, and then I can drag it in and I can use a bunch of trees at once, which can be useful depending on what you're doing. So yeah, nice and simple there. Other than that, for actually making maps, there's not a lot you need to worry about. Just remember terrain. You can do all this stuff. Very cool, very fun. Control Z to undo stuff, by the way. You've got your assets that you import, all that, your spawns,